He bought a ranch for almost nothing, thinking it was only land and broken wood. But when he rode through the dust and saw the widow standing in her late husband's coat, he realized the papers in his pocket carried more than a deed. They carried a storm of love, loss, and a fight for dignity. James Carter rode slowly up the rutted trail that wound across the Wyoming plain, dust curling from his horse's hooves and drifting into the gray evening air. The land was empty, wide, and hushed, with only the steady rasp of wind over dry grass to keep him company. In his pocket lay a folded deed, ink smudged from his thumb. It declared that this place was his, a ranch won for almost nothing at auction. What it did not declare was who waited for him. The house crouched low against the prairie wind, its roof sagging, its porch boards weathered pale. As James drew near, reins slack in his hand, a figure appeared in the doorway. A woman, tall and straight, though her shoulders were draped in a man's coat too large for her frame. The cuffs hung past her wrists, worn dark with work and smoke. Her braid fell untidy against the faded fabric, and her eyes, clear and sharp, watched him with the wariness of someone who had already lost too much. James slipped his hat from his head. "Afternoon," he said, voice quiet, respectful. "Name's James Carter. Paper says I own this place." The woman did not move. Her hand rested on the door frame like it were a rifle stock. "Paper lies," she answered. "This is Eliza Morgan's house. Eliza Morgan is me." Her tone carried no tremor. James dismounted, his boots sinking in dust, and tied his horse to a post cracked by years of sun. "I've no wish to turn a woman out," he said slowly. "I only aim to see what's left here to be kept." Her gaze drifted past him to the empty pasture, to the broken fence leaning like tired bones, and finally to the black seam of clouds on the horizon. "The house keeps," she said at last. "I do the keeping." When she stepped back, the door swung wide. James hesitated, then crossed the threshold. The air smelled of wood smoke, dust, and something faintly sweet, like old apples stored too long. A stove crouched in the corner, its belly scorched black from countless fires. Beside it stood a rocking chair, its paint rubbed bare on the arms where a man's hands had once rested. Above the chair, against the far wall, hung a dress, white, long, and faded at the hem. It stirred gently when a draft slipped through the cracked window, like the ghost of a promise that had never been buried. James paused, hat still in hand, and nodded at it as though it were a person watching him enter. Eliza busied herself with kindling, the set of her mouth hard and straight. Her hands were work-worn, browned by sun, scarred by rope. Ringless. She built a small fire, and when the flames took, she filled a dented coffee pot and set it to boil. James laid the folded deed on the table, but did not push it toward her. "I don't know what your husband left you," he said, voice rough. "I only know what the auctioneer sold me. Truth be told, the price tasted wrong the moment I spoke it." She poured coffee into chipped blue cups, liquid pale as river water, in spring melt. "The price was wrong," she said, settling into the rocking chair without asking. "But law is a boot that steps where it chooses." She handed him a cup. James remained standing, sipping. The coffee was thin but hot, and steam fogged his vision for a moment. The firelight caught on her shawl, folded over the back of the chair. Her braid slipped forward across her shoulder, and she did not move it aside. "You kept this place," he said softly. "Alone." "Alone is not empty," she replied. "Alone lets you hear what the walls are saying." "I left the dress up there so I wouldn't forget the woman I once was." The words fell heavy in the room. They drank in silence, the thin brew filling the quiet more honestly than speech could. James let his eyes take in the crooked window, the patched floorboards, the empty shelves. He thought like a carpenter, measuring not to condemn, but to understand what must be mended. The roof would need patching before winter. The window cried for putty. The walls sagged like tired shoulders but still held. At last he asked, "Your husband?" Her eyes stayed on the fire. "On the hill," she said. "Nothing. More." Her hand reached back for the shawl, fingers tightening as though it were a lifeline. James touched his side, where an old scar prickled with memory. "War took my brothers," he murmured. "I lost myself after." She turned her gaze on him then, swift and sharp. "You look like a man who left the world and never found the gate back in." Then she rose. "I'll show you the well. If you mean to stay, you'll draw water like the rest of us." They stepped outside together. The barn loomed to the left, roof patched with mismatched boards, rust streaking the hinges. Tools leaned against the wall, an axe, a scythe wrapped in oiled cloth, a saw. He touched the smooth handle of the scythe, feeling the imprint left by another man's palm. At the well, the rope squealed as he hauled. Eliza steadied the bucket, her braid lying down her back like a dark river. "This land sits near Lakota trails," she said. "We traded sometimes. My husband called it trespass. I called it weather. It came and went." James nodded. "A man lives by reading weather," he said. Together they carried the water to the trough where the horse blew warm breath into the evening air. From the porch, the empty rocking chair faced them, waiting like a witness. Later, she set bacon to the skillet, mixed flour for biscuits. He split wood until sweat traced his spine, then carried the rounds inside. Without a word, she slid him a plate. He ate by habit, back against the wall, boots never far. When dusk fell, the coyotes began. Their talk, Eliza laid her scarred hands on the table. "You've come with paper," she said. "You could put me out by morning." "I could," James admitted. He folded the deed, slid it back into his pocket. "But the ranch is larger than paper. I bought more than I understand." Her eyes softened, barely. "Understanding comes with work. We'll see if you rise at daybreak." She took the rocking chair, setting it in slow motion, creak steady as a lullaby. James sat by the stove with his knife and whetstone, sharpening in a rhythm like rain on tin. Between them, the stove glowed red and breathed. Later, he unrolled, his blanket near the hearth, boots close by, jacket for a pillow. She disappeared into the back room, shawl wrapped around her shoulders. The wedding dress swayed faintly in the doorway, pale as memory. James lay still, staring at the ceiling beams, listening to the fire and the breathing silence of the house. He did not know if the land would forgive him for claiming it, nor if the widow would forgive him for arriving. But the chair had rocked, the coffee pot had poured, and the house had accepted his weight without complaint. As he closed his eyes, he let the fire draw the ache from him inch by inch, until night claimed. The hills and two strangers shared the same flame. Morning broke gray and cool, a thin sheet of mist lying low in the pasture like the ghost of a river. James rose with it, body aching from the hard floor, hands stiff as if the war had followed him into his sleep. He stepped outside and saw Eliza, already at work. She walked the fence line in worn gloves, braid hanging heavy against the back of her coat. Each wire was checked, each post tested, as though the act itself kept her husband's presence alive. The house had revealed itself to him the night before, but in daylight the traces of her life pressed more sharply. That white dress still hung, in the main room, pale against the dark logs. In another corner leaned a rifle, its stock rubbed smooth where another man's hands had carried it daily. James touched it once, fingers tracing the worn grain, and felt the weight of the hill beyond where its owner lay. He did not move it. Some things belonged to memory alone. When Eliza returned from her rounds, she carried the air of one who belonged to the land, though the land had been cruel. She boiled water for coffee, then sat with letters spread before her. The paper was creased, some of the ink blurred as though touched by rain or by tears. She wrote with a steady hand, pausing often, biting her lip as though the words might betray her. By the time the fire had burned low, she folded each letter carefully and tucked it into a wooden box by the hearth. Not one bore an address. James watched from the table, saying nothing. His own ghosts were loud enough without adding hers. By noon he took himself to the barn. Its roof sagged under years of neglect, shingles missing where storms had torn them. Free. He ran his hand along the beams and felt the weakness there. The war had made him a man who noticed weakness. Weak boards, weak hearts, weak resolve. He set down his hat and rolled up his sleeves. When Eliza came out with a bucket of water, she saw him on the ladder with a hammer in his hand. The sound of nails striking wood rang through the yard. She froze, bucket swinging at her side. "This land was not yours to buy," she said sharply. "Not yours to mend." He looked down, sweat running along his temple. "Rot doesn't ask who owns it. It just keeps eating." Her lips pressed into a line, but she did not tell him to stop. Instead, she turned and carried the bucket toward the trough. When she glanced back, he was still hammering. That evening, they ate in silence again. The air smelled of bacon fat and dust, the windows rattling faintly in the wind. He laid his calloused hands on the table, raw from work. She noticed but said nothing. The days slipped into rhythm. She rose before dawn, shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, and tended the animals. He split wood, patched the fence, lifted what she could not. When he offered to sharpen her tools, she bristled. "They were my husband's," she said. "I know their weight." "And they'll last longer with care," James replied. Reluctantly, she left the scythe on the table. He worked the blade against the whetstone in silence, the sound like rain on a roof. When he finished, he set it down with reverence, and for the first time she met his eyes without challenge. But outside the ranch, the world still had its tongue. Neighbors came by, riding slow along the fence line, tipping their hats with eyes that lingered too long. They whispered in town, Eliza heard, that a widow now lived under a stranger's roof. Some claimed she had already given herself to him. Others said she had betrayed her husband's grave by letting another man's shadow fall across the doorway. She heard the words when she went for flour or sugar, shoulders straight beneath the weight of their stares. "Bought the ranch, bought the wife," one man muttered loud enough for her to hear. She had carried her purchases home that day without a word, but her jaw was set like stone. James noticed her silence that night. She ate without speaking, the lamplight painting her face in lines of gold and shadow. Finally, he said, "I didn't come here for gossip." "Gossip is the currency of this place," she answered, eyes fixed on the flame. "It will spend itself whether we trade in it or not." Beyond gossip, older grudges stirred as well. The ranch lay near Lakota hunting ground, and the settlers still carried bitterness like burrs under their skin. A neighbor warned James in hushed tones that he was a fool to stay. "That land's contested," he said, "and the widow's husband never kept his word with them. Blood lingers longer than wind." James listened but gave no answer. He had fought enough wars to know that anger outlives treaties. Still, when he looked at Eliza, at the set of her shoulders as she lifted buckets or drove nails, he knew she was fighting her own war, one she had little hope of winning alone. The evening stretched long. She would sit at the table with her, letters writing by firelight until her eyes grew heavy. Sometimes the shawl slipped from her shoulders and James, without thinking, would place it back across them. She never thanked him, but she never pulled away. On one such night, as she folded another letter and slid it into the wooden box, he asked quietly, "Who are they for?" She stared at the flames for a long moment. "For the man I loved. For the life I lost. I write so I do not forget the sound of myself when I was still whole." He nodded, saying nothing more. His own memories, the screams of brothers fallen, the crack of muskets, the stink of blood and mud, were letters written across his skin, never sent, never answered. Days later, as he repaired the corral, she came to stand beside him. She watched him hammer a post into place, arms straining, shoulders set against the earth's resistance. At last she said, "You work like you belong here." He paused, leaning on the hammer, breath heavy. "I don't yet, but work is a step toward belonging." The first time she gave him a faint, fleeting smile. It passed as quickly as a shadow across the prairie, but it stayed with him longer than he cared to admit. That night, The rocking chair creaked gently as she sat with her letters. He sat nearby, mending a harness by lamplight. Outside, coyotes sang in the dark. For a moment, the ranch felt less like a battlefield and more like a home. Two wounded souls bound not by love, not yet, but by labor, silence, and the faint hope that ghosts could be laid to rest. The sky broke open at dusk. Clouds rolled heavy and black over the plains, their bellies swollen with rain, their edges torn by lightning that clawed the horizon. James had seen storms before, on battlefields where cannon smoke blurred with thunderclouds where the sky itself seemed to wage war. But here, on this lonely ranch, the violence of the heavens felt even larger, even more merciless. The first drops struck the roof like thrown stones. By nightfall, the rain came in sheets, rattling against the windows, seeping through cracks in the walls, pooling in the corners of the floor. The wind howled down the chimney, flinging sparks into the room. The little house groaned as though it would tear from its moorings and tumble across the open land. Inside, the fire burned low, its glow a frail defense against the storm's rage. Eliza sat rigid in the rocking chair, her braid clutched tight in one hand, knuckles white with tension. Her shawl slipped from her shoulders, forgotten. She stared at the flames as if the fire alone held her together. James crouched beside the stove, feeding it with wood in measured intervals, steadying the blaze. Every crack of thunder jolted through him, dragging him back to nights when the world had split open with artillery, when men screamed in mud and darkness. His scars ached, not from pain but from memory. When another crash of thunder rattled the glass, Eliza flinched, the cup in her hand spilling thin coffee across her lap. Without words, James reached across, covering her trembling fingers with his calloused hand. His touch was firm, steady, silent. She looked at him then, eyes wide and vulnerable, but she did not pull away. For a moment, the storm outside and the storm within beat the same rhythm. Hours passed. The wind screamed, the house shuddered, and James and Eliza endured in silence, bound by necessity and fear. He patched leaks with rags, wedged furniture against the door when the latch rattled, and returned to the hearth to sit near her, there, shoulders almost touching. It was near midnight when a knock came, sharp, heavy, desperate. Eliza froze, her breath catching. James rose slowly, rifle in hand, the firelight flashing along its barrel. The knock came again, louder this time, drowned by thunder but unmistakable. James moved to the door and lifted the latch. There stood a Lakota rider, rain streaming from his hair, shoulders bowed with weariness. His horse shifted in the darkness, nostrils flaring steam. The man's eyes, black and steady, met James's without flinching. Eliza gasped softly. "Silent Hawk," she whispered. The rider inclined, his head once water dripping from his braids. "I seek fire," he said simply. Suspicion hung thick in the air. James kept the rifle lowered but ready, gaze measuring the man's stance. Eliza stepped forward, her face pale, torn between memory and fear. Silent Hawk had once traded with her husband, meat for tools, herbs for grain. She remembered his calm voice, the way he never wasted words. But she also remembered the tension her husband carried after each exchange, muttering about trespass and danger. "What brings you here?" James asked, his tone neither welcoming nor harsh. Silent Hawk's shoulders rose and fell with a weary sigh. Cattle raids stir to the south, settlers whisper of vengeance. The land grows restless, storms above, storms below. I bring warning. Eliza's eyes flicked to James. She wanted to believe him, she always had, but grief and suspicion had taught her to be cautious. James studied the man, then slowly lowered the rifle and stepped aside. "Fire's thin but steady. Come in." The Lakota stepped into the small room, water dripping from his leggings onto the floorboards. He moved with quiet dignity, as if every step carried the weight of generations. James offered him a place near the fire, then ladled coffee into a cup and slid it across. Silent Hawk accepted, bowing his head slightly in acknowledgement. Eliza watched from the rocking chair, her fingers twisting the edge of her shawl. Her husband had never allowed such gestures of hospitality. To him, Silent Hawk was always an intruder, a shadow. Yet here was James, a man who owed nothing to this ranch, extending food and warmth to someone others would turn away. The three of them sat in silence while rain hammered the roof and thunder shook the ground. The fire hissed as water dripped through the cracks above. James sharpened his knife slowly, the stone rasping in rhythm with the storm. Eliza's gaze darted between them, her heart a battlefield of mistrust and longing. At last, Silent Hawk spoke again. "Your neighbors are restless. They speak of you, woman, of the widow who lets a stranger share her roof." His eyes flicked toward James. "And of you, who bought land that carries old debts." Eliza stiffened, shame and anger burning in her chest. James only nodded, as though he had expected nothing less. "They will come," Silent Hawk said. "Not tonight, perhaps, but soon." James set down the knife. "And you? Why warn us?" The Lakota met his gaze steadily. "Because storms kill without asking who owns the land, and because once this house gave me bread and water. Debt paid with debt." Eliza's throat tightened. She remembered the day clearly now. Her husband away, her cupboards nearly bare, Silent Hawk at the door with venison in his pack. She had traded flour and salt for meat. He had said nothing more than, "Good trade," but in that silence, she had felt respect, even kindness. Now, seeing him before her again, soaked and weary, yet still dignified, she felt the tug of that old trust. But fear held her back. Fear of what neighbors would say. Fear of what hospitality to him might cost. James, however, seemed untroubled. He pushed a plate of bread across the table. "Eat, then rest. Storm's not letting up till morning." Silent Hawk accepted, tearing the bread slowly, carefully, as though it were ritual. The firelight painted his face in bronze and shadow, his eyes reflecting the flames. For the rest of the night, the three sat together while the storm howled. Eliza's shoulders eased little by little, her hands no longer trembling. James kept, his rifle within reach but his posture loose, a soldier at rest rather than on guard. Silent Hawk ate, drank, and finally leaned back, eyes closing as though sleep might claim him at last. The storm outside raged on, but within those four walls, a fragile peace held. When Eliza finally rose to bank the fire, she glanced at James. For the first time, she saw not just a drifter who had bought her home, but a man who steadied trembling hands, who opened his door to an old ally where others would shut it. In that moment, she understood what James had already learned. Survival on this land was not earned by pride or paper, but by trust. Trust given carefully, painfully, but given all the same. The storm did not pass with the night. By morning, the rain had grown steadier, pouring down the roof in silver ropes, finding every crack and flaw in the old shingles. The wind hissed through the eaves like a warning, and the little house groaned, under the weight of weather it was never built to bear. Inside, three souls shared one flame. The fire hissed and smoked, wood too damp to burn clean. James fed it with careful patience, each log placed as if he were laying bricks in a wall. Silent Hawk sat nearby, sharpening a bone-handled knife, his movements calm, precise, unbothered by the storm. Eliza moved about the room, shawl clutched close, her braid slipping loose with the damp. The air was thick with silence, heavier than the smoke curling up the chimney. It was Eliza who broke it first. Her voice was sharp as a nail struck wrong. "My husband built this house with his hands. Every log, every shingle. He swore to me it would hold." James glanced toward the ceiling, where water dripped in steady rhythm into a bucket. "Your husband built well," he said, "but time and weather take what oaths cannot keep." Her eyes flashed. "You speak as if you knew him. You didn't." "No," James agreed evenly. "But I know men who build, and I know graves that keep their silence." The words struck hard. Eliza stiffened, clutching her shawl tighter. Silent Hawk lifted his gaze briefly from the knife, studying them both, then returned to his work without a word. The tension thickened. Memories prowled the room like restless shadows. Eliza's husband, who had traded with Silent Hawk yet broken promises behind his back. James, who had fought men like Silent Hawk across battlefields where treaties were words blown away by powder, smoke. And Silent Hawk himself, scarred by both betrayal and survival, now seated in the home of those who once called him enemy. Each carried history like a weapon, unsheathed but not yet used. By afternoon, the leaks grew worse. Rain tapped onto the table, onto the floorboards, filling pans and pots until the room echoed with the constant drip of water. James pulled on his coat. "Roof won't last another night," he said. "Needs fixing." Eliza bristled. "This is not your house." James met her gaze steadily. "It is the only roof over your head. That makes it mine to mend." For a moment she looked ready to strike back with words sharper than any blade, but then a loud crack split the air, one of the beams groaning under strain. She turned toward the sound, fear flickering across her face. Without another word, she fetched a lantern. Together they stepped into the storm. The wind cut at them, rain soaking through cloth and skin. James set the ladder against the sagging roof, water rushing down in cold sheets. Silent Hawk rose without hesitation, his knife tucked away, his hand steady on the ladder's base. Eliza stood near, holding the lantern high, its glow trembling in the rain. James climbed, hammer clenched between his teeth, nails in his pocket. He worked fast, shoulders braced against the wind, each strike ringing like a bell in the storm. Below, Eliza lifted the lantern higher, light spilling across his frame as he fought the weather. Her braid clung to her cheek, her dress plastered to her legs, but her grip on the lantern never wavered. Wolves howled in the distance, their voices carried thin through the rain. The sound sent a shiver down Eliza's spine. "They're close," she whispered. Silent Hawk nodded. Storm drives them near. They wait for weakness. James hammered harder, each strike a defiance not just of the rain, but of everything that threatened this fragile shelter. Water ran into his eyes, plastered. His hair against his skull soaked his shirt until it clung like a second skin. Still he worked, breath sharp, jaw set. When at last the worst of the gaps were patched, he climbed down, boots sinking in the mud. Eliza met him with the lantern, her face pale but alive with a spark he had not seen before. For a heartbeat, their eyes met in the rain, two souls caught between ruin and survival. And then, unexpectedly, she laughed. It was brief, brittle as glass, but it rang true against the storm. "You look a fool," she said, voice catching, like a drowned rat swinging a hammer against God's own flood. James blinked, startled. Then a chuckle escaped him, rough and low, rising into something almost warm. Silent Hawk, silent no, longer, allowed himself the ghost of a smile as he steadied the ladder. The three of them stood there in the storm, soaked to the bone, laughing as if the sound itself could hold back the darkness. It was a fragile joy, a candle flame in a room, full of shadows, but it burned all the same. Back inside, they shed wet coats, hung them near the fire. The stove hissed, steam rising from soaked cloth. Eliza fetched dry shawls, placing one over James's shoulders before catching herself and retreating quickly to her chair. He said nothing, only pulled it closer, grateful. Silent Hawk sat again near the fire, knife across his knees, eyes steady. "Storm is long," he said quietly, "but storms end." Eliza looked at him, then at James, then at the roof above them, still dripping but no longer collapsing. She thought of her husband's promises, of graves on the hill, of letters unsent. And for the first time she wondered if survival meant loosening her grip on the dead. James stretched his hands toward the fire, fingers scarred, palms rough from work. Eliza studied those hands and saw not just intrusion, but labor freely given, sweat poured into her home without demand for thanks. The bitterness that had clung to her began, if only slightly, to crack. Outside, wolves circled, their cries swallowed by the storm. But inside, three weary souls shared bread, fire, and laughter that lingered like warmth even after silence returned. The storm might rage another night, but beneath that roof, patched by one man's hammer, steadied by another's hands, lit by a widow's lantern. Something new had begun to take shape. Not yet trust, not yet peace, but the first fragile step toward both. The storm eased at last, leaving the land hushed beneath a gray sky. For days afterward, the ground lay sodden, the air heavy with the smell of wet earth. James took those days to mend what he could, the roof, the fences, the tools left too, long unused. Eliza kept to her chores, though her eyes lingered more often on him now, watching the way he moved through the work, as if he were part of the land itself. It was late one evening when the accident came. James was at the corral, lantern hanging from a nail, hammer in hand as he fastened new rails. Eliza had brought him water, her shawl drawn tight against the night chill. Silent Hawk lingered at the edge of the yard, mending a length of rope. In the fading light, a single spark changed everything. The lantern swayed as James struck nail to wood. It tipped, spilling oil across a pile of dry hay stacked too near. In a breath, the flame caught. Hay hissed, then roared, a sudden wall of fire that leapt upward, hungry and fast. "James!" Eliza cried, dropping the bucket. He was already moving, seizing the lantern and flinging it clear, but the blaze had begun its feast. Heat blasted outward, sparks flying into the corral. Horses screamed, hooves striking earth in panic. The barn's old timbers, dry from years of sun, lit like kindling. "Get the horses!" James shouted, voice raw above the roar. Eliza ran without. Hesitation, skirts tangling, braid whipping loose. She fumbled at latches with trembling hands, coughing as smoke poured thick and acrid into her lungs. The animals reared, eyes wide with terror. She clung to their halters, pulling them free one by one, her dress tearing at the hem, her arms streaked with soot. James threw himself into the flames, seizing buckets, hurling water where he could, smothering sparks with old blankets. His shirt stuck to his skin, sweat and smoke stinging his eyes. He worked with a fury that belonged to a man who had seen fire before, not in barns, but in battles, where powder wagons went up like thunder and men burned in the mud. Silent Hawk appeared beside him, calm even in chaos. He heaved water with steady rhythm, face set, eyes bright with reflection of flame. Together they fought like men who had once been enemies but now shared a single enemy greater than themselves. Eliza stumbled from the smoke, leading the last horse clear. Her braid had come undone, hair spilling wild across her face, her shawl lost to the fire. She turned back even as James shouted for her to stay away. "I won't leave it all to burn," she cried. She seized a bucket herself, flinging water against the blaze, her breath ragged, eyes stinging. James caught her arm once, voice hoarse. "You'll choke." "So will you," she answered, and tore free. The night filled with coughing, shouting. The crash of timbers as part of the roof gave way. Sparks rained down like fiery snow, clinging to their clothes, searing their skin. Yet they did not stop. Again and again, water struck fire, hiss and roar dueling in the dark. By the time the eastern sky began to pale, the barn stood half-charred, roof caved on one side, walls blackened. But the fire was beaten back. The animals lived. The corral, though scorched, still held. Smoke drifted upward in lazy gray trails, no longer a monster but a ghost. James staggered to the fence and sank against it, chest heaving. His face was streaked black, hair plastered to his brow, eyes bloodshot from smoke. Eliza collapsed beside him, her dress torn, arms raw with burns and scrapes. Her head fell back against the rails, breath ragged. Silent Hawk leaned nearby, shoulders bowed but steady, his expression unreadable. For a long while, none of them spoke. Only the crackle of dying embers and the quiet whicker of horses filled the air. Then Eliza turned her head toward James. Her face was ash-streaked, lips cracked, eyes shining with exhaustion and something more fragile. "I thought," she whispered, her voice breaking, "that I buried my life with him on that hill. Thought nothing could stir it again." James looked at her, scarred hands resting useless in his lap. The firelight painted her hair in wild bronze, strands, her cheeks smeared with soot. She had never looked less like the solemn widow who haunted her own rooms. She looked alive, burned, battered, but alive. You. Her throat caught, but she forced the words. You make it breathe again. James's chest tightened. He had not expected it, not from her, not here, not now when ash still clung to his skin. He swallowed, voice low. War hollowed me, left me wandering half a man. I thought land would anchor me, thought silence would heal me. But maybe. He glanced toward her, toward the ruined barn, the saved animals, the dawn breaking, faint behind the smoke. Maybe it's this land, this fire. You. Her eyes softened, tears carving pale tracks down her soot-stained cheeks. She reached for his hand, tentative, uncertain. He did not hesitate. His scarred fingers closed around hers, firm and steady. Silent Hawk watched, silent as ever, but the corner of his mouth lifted in what might have been approval. He turned back to the smoldering barn, shoulders squared against the rising sun. Together they sat until the sky grew gold, until the smoke thinned to nothing, until the night's terror became memory. The fire had taken half the barn, yet it had left behind something stronger, an unspoken bond forged in ash and sweat, in fear and survival. From ashes, renewal. From ruin, the faint spark of love not yet named but no longer denied. The days after the fire passed in uneasy quiet. The barn stood blackened but upright, the horses restless yet alive. James and Eliza moved through their chores with a new rhythm, less like strangers, more like partners bound by sweat and ash. Silent Hawk remained for a time, helping mend what could be saved, his silence as steady as the hills. But the outside world had not forgotten them. Word of the blaze spread quickly, carried by riders into town. With it came whispers that the widow had thrown in her lot with a drifter, that a Lakota man slept beneath her roof, that honor had been buried alongside her husband. By the week's end, the whispers hardened into something heavier. It was late afternoon when the riders came. James heard them first, the rumble of hooves carrying anger across the dry earth. He stepped onto the porch, rifle resting in the crook of his arm. Eliza appeared beside him, shawl drawn around her shoulders, braid loose from the day's work. Silent Hawk stood in the yard, sharpening a post with calm hands, but his eyes flicked. Toward the horizon, 6 men rode up, dust rising behind them. Their hats were pulled low, rifles across their saddles. Neighbors, all of them, faces James had seen at the auction, faces Eliza had once nodded to in town. Yet now those faces carried only suspicion. You've taken what ain't yours, Carter, one called, his voice sharp. Bought a ranch, sure. But you also bought a widow, and now you harbor savages on her land. James said nothing. The wind tugged at his coat. Another man spat into the dust. We won't have it. We won't see this valley turned over to outlaws and redskins. Hand him over. He jerked his chin toward Silent Hawk. And make clean what you've dirtied. Eliza stepped forward before James could answer. She moved down the steps with steady grace, shawl trailing, eyes lit with a calm fire. This ranch is mine, she said, voice clear. My husband's grave lies on the hill yonder. This land was his, then mine. And this man, she touched James's arm, her fingers lingering just long enough, is my husband now, by choice, not by law. A murmur rippled through the riders. One lifted his rifle higher, face twisted. You shame yourself, Eliza. You shame his memory. Her braid slid across her shoulder as she straightened. I carry his memory in every board of this house, in every nail of that barn. But memory is not life. I choose life. The men shifted uneasily, but bitterness still simmered. One growled. And what of him? His rifle pointed toward Silent Hawk, who stood tall and silent in the yard, his face calm as stone. At last, Silent Hawk raised his hand. The gesture was simple, steady. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the still air. Once, I traded, here. Bread and water were given to me when I had none. I repaid that debt with warning, and with work. Now I stand free of debt. What I have done cannot be called dishonor, the riders muttered. One cursed under his breath. Another shifted, in his saddle uneasy. Old grudges lived long, but debts lived longer. Men remembered when venison had filled their tables, when warning had spared their herds. Slowly, shame crept into their anger. James lifted his rifle, not to aim, but to rest it across his shoulder. His voice was calm, steady as the hills. This ranch will stand with whoever works it, whoever bleeds for it. That's the only law worth keeping. For a long moment the standoff held, dust swirling, rifles half raised, breath caught between action and restraint. Then one by one, the riders lowered their weapons. A mutter passed among them, bitter but subdued. At last they wheeled their horses and rode back the way they came, their silhouettes fading into the evening light. Silence followed, broken only by the creak of the rocking chair on the porch as wind brushed past. Eliza let out a breath she had been holding, her hand still on James's arm. Silent Hawk bowed his head once, then turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the sun sank in fire behind the hills. James saddled the horse. Without words, Eliza joined him. Together they rode up the slope, hooves sinking into soft earth, until they reached the small hill where wildflowers clung stubbornly between rocks. There lay the grave of her husband, marked by a simple wooden cross, weathered gray by sun and rain. Eliza dismounted slowly. She stood before the grave, shawl tight around her shoulders, eyes shining in the fading light. For a long while she said nothing. Then she slipped the shawl from her shoulders, the same shawl she had worn since his death, the one that had clung to her through storm and fire, and laid it gently across the grave. "Goodbye," she whispered, voice breaking yet strong. "I carried you as far as I could, but now I must carry myself." James stood back, hat in hand, watching the woman who had once seemed carved from grief. She turned then, her face raw but unburdened, and reached for his scarred hand. He took it, the roughness of his palm meeting hers in a grip that spoke not of passion, but of shared survival, of dignity earned together. As they rode back down the hill, the sky above had cleared. The storm clouds were gone, the air washed clean. Light spread across the valley, soft and golden, touching the blackened barn, the patched roof, the weary fences. The ranch no longer felt empty. It breathed again, alive with second chances, with dignity, with unexpected love.